The heavy scent of rust and floor wax was punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic crack of a crowbar. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon at Lincoln High, and the maintenance crew was finally clearing out the dead bank, a row of lockers that had been sealed shut since the structural shift in the late 90s. Sarah, a history teacher, known for her iron-pressed blouses and a silence that felt like a physical weight, stood nearby, supervising the cleanup with her usual detached calm. With a final, agonizing groan of metal, Locker 402 surrendered. A small, leather-bound wallet tumbled out, hitting the linoleum with a heavy, metallic thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. When it flipped open, a silver shield caught the flickering fluorescent light, gleaming with a cold, predatory light. It wasn't a toy. The tarnished eagle and the bold engraving of the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent a ripple of absolute silence through the hallway. Sarah's pulse didn't spike. It steadied, a cold, familiar clarity washing over her, like a baptism of ice. She stepped forward before the janitor could touch it, her movements fluid and predatory. "Don't move," she said, her voice dropping into a low, authoritative register that made the grown man freeze in his tracks. She saw the name etched into the silver, Special Agent Elias Thorne. The name was a ghost from a life she had buried under piles of lesson plans and grading rubrics. Thorne had been her commanding officer, the man she had loved, and the man she had officially declared dead after a deep-cover operation in the Pacific Northwest went up in flames 15 years ago. Seeing that badge here, in a nondescript American high school, wasn't just a discovery, it was a calculated message. As Principal Miller hurried down the hall, his face pale and sweating, Sarah felt the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing against the school walls. She noticed something else. A microscopic blinking LED embedded in the eagle's eye. The chip was still transmitting. The discovery wasn't the end of a mystery. It was the activation of a sleeper cell that had been dormant for a decade. Thorne hadn't just lost this badge, he had planted it, knowing exactly whose feet it would land at. The game she thought she had escaped was officially back in play, and the school was the new board. Principal Miller's office felt smaller than usual, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee, old paper, and rising panic. He sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the badge as if it were a live grenade capable of leveling the building. "I've called the local police, Sarah. It's a liability. We can't have federal property sitting in a student locker. The school board will have my head if this leaks." Sarah stood by the window, her eyes tracking Marcus, the school's security guard, who was suddenly pacing the perimeter of the parking lot with a tactical radio pressed to his ear. "The local police won't know what to do with that, Rick," Sarah said calmly, her gaze never wavering from the window. "And if you report it through official channels, you might find that Locker 402 was never on the school's registry. Someone has been paying to keep that locker sealed through a shell company for years." She reached out and took the badge back before Miller could protest. Something in her gaze told him she was no longer just a history teacher. She flipped the leather casing over and found a small, handwritten slip tucked behind the identification card. It was a string of alphanumeric code, 14.4.1.99. To anyone else, it looked like a locker combination. To Sarah, it was a grid coordinate for the school's library archives, formatted in the old bureau filing style. She left Miller stuttering and headed straight for the library, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. The school was a maze she had spent 5 years memorizing, but now she saw it through the lens of an operative. The cameras weren't just for student safety, their angles were positioned to cover dead zones in the basement and utility tunnels. As she entered the library, she spotted Leo, a brilliant but socially isolated senior who spent his lunches hacking into the school's outdated server for sport. "Leo," she whispered, leaning over his laptop, "I need you to look up the 1999 SPAF payroll for this building, specifically the night shift consultants." Leo looked up, his eyes widening. Miss Sarah? You look different, like you're about to go to war. She didn't blink. Just find the names, Leo. History is about to repeat itself, and we need to know who wrote the first draft. Leo's fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing the school's firewall with an ease that would have normally earned him a permanent detention. Here it is, he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. But it's weird. The 1999 payroll has 5 employees who don't have Social Security numbers tied to them. They're listed as mechanical consultants. And look at the building blueprints from that year. He pulled up a grainy architectural scan on his screen. There's a room marked mechanical storage beneath the gymnasium. But in the 2010 renovation maps, that room is gone. It was walled off, not demolished. It's a phantom space. Sarah studied the screen, her mind overlaying the coordinates from the badge, 14.4.1.99, onto the blueprint. They aligned perfectly with a ventilation shaft leading to that hidden room. Stay here, Leo. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, trigger the fire alarm and get everyone to the parking lot, Sarah commanded. She made her way toward the gymnasium, her mind racing through the implications. Elias Thorne hadn't been a rogue agent. He had been a sentinel, guarding something buried beneath the foundation. This school wasn't just an educational institution. It was built on top of something immensely valuable. As she moved through the locker rooms, she noticed Marcus, the security guard, trailing her from a distance. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He had a hand on his holster, a high-end piece of hardware that no suburban school guard should be carrying. Sarah ducked into the equipment shed, her heart rate steadying as her muscle memory took over. She grabbed a heavy-duty athletic jump rope and a roll of industrial tape, improvising gear. She wasn't a teacher today. She was an operative in an enemy stronghold. She reached the vent leading to the void space and felt a draft of cold, filtered air. That meant the room wasn't empty. It was being climate-controlled to protect sensitive hardware. Someone was keeping something, or someone, preserved beneath the feet of 3,000 unsuspecting teenagers. She unscrewed the vent cover, the metal clicking softly, and slid into the darkness. The drop was 10 feet, but she landed like a cat, her eyes adjusting to the blue glow of a subterranean world. Dropping into the hidden room was like stepping into a cold, blue-lit tomb of modern technology. The air was sterile and chilled, illuminated by the humming glow of server racks that were far too advanced for a forgotten storage space. Sarah landed silently, her eyes scanning the room for threats. This was a surveillance hub, a nerve center of illegal data. One wall was covered in monitors showing live feeds of the school, but these weren't standard views. They were pinhole cameras inside the teacher's lounge, the counselor's office, and even her own classroom. She saw a recorded loop of herself standing in locker 402 just 30 minutes prior. On a central desk sat a stack of files. She flicked through them, her blood turning to ice. They were psychological profiles of every student with a high IQ, including Leo. It's called the Inheritance Project, Sarah. The voice came from the dark corner of the room, smooth and motherly. Mrs. Gable, the school's soft-spoken, kindly counselor, stepped into the blue light. She wasn't holding a tea mug. She was holding a suppressed 9mm with a professional grip. Elias was the first to realize that the best way to recruit the next generation of deep-cover assets was to start before they even graduated. We've been grooming them here for decades under the guise of guidance. Sarah didn't flinch, even with the muzzle pointed at her heart. You're not FBI, Diane. You're a broker. You're selling these children to the highest bidder in the private sector. Gable smiled, a cold, empty expression that reached nowhere near her eyes. And you were our greatest failure, Sarah. You walked away. But Elias, he couldn't leave. He's still here, in a way. He's the one who left the badge. He's losing his mind, Sarah. He started leaving breadcrumbs like a senile Hansel, hoping you'd come and finish what he couldn't. The betrayal was structural, built into the very foundation of the school she had called home. Sarah realized she hadn't been hiding in a safe haven. She had been living inside the belly of the beast she tried to escape, and Gable was the one holding the leash. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, her voice a low growl that vibrated with suppressed violence. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, calculating the distance between her and Gable. "He's in the one place no one ever looks," Gable replied, gesturing to the monitors. "The maintenance bunker under the bus depot. He's the ghost that keeps the infrastructure running while the world ignores him." Suddenly, the monitors flickered. A new feed appeared. Marcus, the security guard, was holding Leo by the scruff of his neck in the library. "We have the boy," Marcus's voice crackled over the internal intercom, "and we found the files she took from the archives." Gable's eyes narrowed, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You see, Sarah, you brought an innocent child into a federal-level conspiracy. That's not very morally strong of you, is it?" Sarah's mind worked at a lightning pace, processing the tactical landscape. She had taught history long enough to know that every empire fell because of internal rot and hubris. She threw the heavy leather wallet she had been holding, not at Gable, but at the overhead sprinkler sensor. The heavy metal badge struck the glass bulb with a violent shatter. Instantly, the room was drenched in a torrential downpour of pressurized water. The servers hissed and sparked, filling the room with thick, acrid smoke and the smell of ozone. In the chaos, Sarah lunged. She didn't use her fists. She used a tactical disarm she hadn't practiced in a decade, but her body remembered. A sharp twist of Gable's wrist, a knee to the solar plexus, and the gun was in Singer's hand before Gable could even scream. She didn't shoot. She didn't have the time. She used the butt of the weapon to knock Gable unconscious with a single, precise blow. She had no time for a trial or explanations. She had to get to Leo, and she had to find the man she thought was a memory before the cleaners arrived to wipe the site. The school was descending into a state of emergency, and Sarah was the only person left who knew the difference between the victims and the monsters. The school was in a state of controlled, screaming chaos. The fire alarm Sarah had ordered Leo to pull was finally wailing, sending hundreds of panicked students pouring into the hallways in a sea of bright backpacks. Sarah moved against the current, a shadow in the storm of teenage confusion. She reached the library just as Marcus was dragging Leo toward a rear service exit. "Let him go, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the wail of the alarm like a frozen blade. The security guard spun around, using Leo as a human shield, his own weapon drawn. "You're out of your league, teacher. This is a private contract. The school board is just a shell company for an organization you can't even name." Leo looked terrified, his face pale, but when his eyes met Sarah's, he saw the hidden strength she had kept tucked away for years. "Miss Sarah, the server! I uploaded the payroll files to the cloud before they caught me," he yelled. Marcus tightened his grip, but Sarah was already in motion. She didn't aim at Marcus. She knew he was wearing a vest. She aimed at the heavy, rolling library ladder behind him. A single, suppressed shot severed the locking mechanism. The massive oak ladder slid down the rail with the force of a freight train, slamming into Marcus's shoulder and throwing him off balance. Sarah was on him in a second, a blur of controlled violence. She pinned him to the floor, her knee pressed into his carotid artery with enough pressure to signal his mortality. "Who is the ghost?" she demanded, her face inches from his. Marcus choked out a laugh, blood staining his teeth. "You think you're saving him? You're just delivering him to the man who built the cage in the first place." Sarah looked at the library security monitors, which were still functioning. The bus depot was lit up with black SUVs that didn't belong to any local agency. They weren't there to evacuate. They were there to harvest the inheritance. She grabbed Leo, her hand firm on his shoulder. "We're going to the depot. Stay low, stay behind me, and don't stop running until I tell you to." Sarah and Leo sprinted across the rain-slicked football field, the distant sirens of the local police providing a false sense of hope that Sarah knew was an illusion. She knew the local cops would be turned away at the gate by men with federal credentials that looked more real than the truth. They reached the bus depot, a cavernous metal building at the edge of the property where the yellow buses sat like slumbering giants. Inside, the air smelled of diesel, grease, and cold secrets. The black SUVs were lined up, their engines idling with a low, menacing thrum. Men in tactical gear were loading crates into the back of a modified school bus, crates labeled Student Records 1999 to 2024. This wasn't just a recruitment program, it was a massive blackmail database spanning a generation. "Leo, get inside the wheel well of the last bus and stay down," Sarah whispered, her eyes scanning the depot for high-ground shooters. She checked the magazine of the captured pistol. 3 rounds left. She needed to be surgical. She moved through the shadows of the depot, using the massive tires of the buses for cover. She saw Miller, the principal, standing near the lead SUV, looking more like a terrified errand boy than an administrator. He was talking to a tall man in a charcoal suit, whose face was obscured by the shadows of a brimmed hat. "We have to leave now," Miller pleaded, his voice cracking. "The history teacher, she knows everything. She's not who we thought she was." The man in the suit turned, and for a fleeting second, the light caught his profile. Sarah gasped, her heart stopping. It wasn't Elias Thorne. It was the man who had supposedly killed Elias, Director Julian Vance, the very man who had signed Sarah's retirement papers and given her the safe identity she now inhabited. The betrayal went all the way to the top of the Bureau's hierarchy. She had been living in a curated reality, watched by the very man who claimed to have set her free from the life of an operative. Every lesson she taught had been under his thumb. Sarah felt a cold, white-hot fury ignite in her chest. She had been played like a novice. Her retirement had been a way to keep her close to the project without her knowing she was essentially a high-level guard dog for a black site. She moved toward the back of the depot, where a lone figure was hunched over an open engine manifold of a bus that looked decades old. The man was gaunt, his hair a shock of white, his clothes tattered and grease-stained. He was muttering to himself, his hands moving with the precision of a master mechanic who could take apart a world and put it back together. "Elias," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling for the first time in 15 years. The man froze. He turned slowly, his eyes vacant and haunted, the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the dark. When he saw Sarah, a flicker of recognition sparked in the gloom. "Agent Sarah," he croaked, his voice like gravel. "You found the badge. I left it so you'd stop them. I couldn't do it alone." He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, smelling of motor oil and old tobacco. "They're using the buses, Sarah. The yellow buses. They've installed signal jammers in the roofs. They're taking the kids to a leadership retreat, but they'll never come back to this town. They're being processed into the system." He pointed to a laptop connected to the bus's diagnostic port. "I've locked the GPS. They can't leave the lot without my override. But Vance, he knows I'm the one who did it. He's coming for the boy." Just then, the heavy bay doors of the depot slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the building. The charcoal-suited man, Director Vance, stood at the entrance with a dozen armed mercenaries. "Elias, you are always such a sentimental fool," Vance called out, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "And Sarah, you were always too observant for your own good. It's a shame. You would have made a brilliant principal of this entire operation if you had just stayed in your lane." "You're not taking these kids, Vance," Sarah shouted, stepping out from behind the bus, her gun leveled at the director with a steady, unbreakable aim. The mercenaries raised their rifles in a synchronized movement, but Vance held up a hand, a smug smile on his face. "And how do you plan to stop us, Sarah? You have a handful of bullets and a broken partner who can barely remember his own name. I have the weight of the government and the silence of the law behind me." Sarah smiled back, a sharp, intimidating expression that made the nearest mercenary flinch despite his training. "I don't need the government, Julian. I have a history student with a very fast internet connection." On cue, the depot's PA system erupted with a deafening screech of feedback that made the men wince. Leo had successfully accessed the depot's internal audio-visual system from his hiding spot. "Attention, Oak Ridge High," Leo's voice boomed, broadcast not just in the depot, but across every smart device in the school district through the emergency alert system. "My name is Leo, and I am currently being kidnapped by Director Julian Vance of the FBI. If you are hearing this, please look at the live stream on the school's website right now." The monitors on the buses suddenly displayed the Inheritance Project files, the psychological profiles, the illegal recruitment videos, and the faces of the consultants who were actually human traffickers for the state. Sarah had used Leo to turn the surveillance state against itself. The mercenaries hesitated, looking at each other. They were professionals, but they weren't prepared for a viral scandal in the middle of a tactical extraction. The power of the quiet teacher was her ability to see the world not as it was told, but as it was recorded. Vance's face contorted in rage. He had lost control of the narrative, and in his world, the narrative was the only thing that kept him in power. He looked at Sarah with a venomous intensity that promised a slow death. "You think this ends here? You've just signed a death warrant for every child in this town." "Kill them all!" Vance screamed, the mask of the professional director finally shattering. But before a single trigger could be pulled, the ground beneath the depot groaned with a deep metallic rumble. Elias Thorne had done more than just lock the GPS. He had rigged the decommissioned fiber optic hub beneath the school to overload. Blue sparks began to rain from the ceiling like a futuristic storm as the high voltage lines surged beyond their capacity. Sarah grabbed Elias and Leo, shoving them into the reinforced security office just as the depot's electrical grid detonated in a brilliant flash of light that turned night into day. When the smoke cleared, Vance and his men were gone, having fled into the night as the local police and news crews finally breached the gates, led by the digital trail Leo had left behind. As Sarah stood in the wreckage, watching the students being reunited with their crying parents, Elias leaned against her, his strength failing. "It's over, Sarah. The project is dead. The files are public." Sarah looked at the silver badge in her hand, the metal warm from the fire. She flipped it over one last time, noticing a tiny inscription she had missed in the chaos. It wasn't Elias Thorne. It was Sarah Thorne. She realized with a jolt of electricity that her entire memory of her past was a construct. She hadn't been an agent who retired. She had been the very first subject of the Inheritance Project, her memories wiped and rewritten 15 years ago to turn her into the perfect sleeper agent, to guard the school. Elias wasn't her partner. He was her father, the man who had built the system to protect her from the monsters, only to become one himself. The history, she taught, was a lie. A series of dates and names meant to keep her mind occupied. She looked at the news cameras, her eyes cold, calculating, and finally, truly awake. "Class is in session," she whispered to the lens. The school was a ruin, but Sarah Thorne was finally real. The hunt for her true identity was now the only history that mattered, and she had all the tools to burn the past down.